Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Mein Augen, schließ, jetzt, which translates to I close my eyes now. Fairly straightforward chorale, really not too much to write home about this one. Very beautiful nonetheless. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So, one sharp in the key signature. We start on G major, we end on G major. I reckon we're in the key of G major here. Passing tones in the lower voices, and then that takes us to G major over B. B, G, D, and G. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral, just need to change the figured bass. Another passing tone in the bass before we get D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our 5 chord. Passing 7th in the bass, and that takes us to G major over B again, B, G, D, and G, 1, 6. That takes us to A, C, E, and A. We're getting ready for an imperfect authentic cadence here, and although 2 might be a valid analysis for some, I do think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and this is rather 7-6. If you've seen 1-6 and 7-6 in concert or in succession with one another, chances are you know what's going to happen on the next beat. We're going to get a root position tonic triad, G, D, G, and B. 1-6, 7-6, 1, or the retrograde is a very common progression in the chorales. Next is another imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, so no modulations just yet. We have B, D, G, and D, which is just taking our tonic triad and inverting it. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Then we get C, C, F sharp, and E. I do think this, I was confusing this F sharp with this F sharp. I do think the G is our chord tone here, and this F sharp is an embellishment. It looks like on the surface a suspension's happening here, but it'd be a 5-4 suspension. And sometimes that ends up being the case, but the majority of the time when we have a consonance leading into a dissonance, it's not the tone that looks like a suspension on the page. That's the chord tone. It's usually the tone that's being suspended. So this is C major in root position. That's our 4 chord. That takes us to C, D, G, and D. I think the C is the lower suspension, probably like a 9/10 suspension underneath one of the D's, either in the tenor or in the melody. But this B being our bass would make this a 1-6 chord. That takes us to A, E, G, and C. It's A minor 7 in root position, 2-7. C is a chord tone, E is a chord tone, but D and F sharp are non-chord tones, and very briefly takes the chord and introduces this idea of 5-4-3. It's kind of an interesting chord progression here, because typically we would just expect the A to go right down to G, but Bach has an extra beat here where he reiterates the 5. D, D, F sharp, and C, which is just taking our chord and putting it in root position, but there's no 5th in the chord, so yeah. This D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. What was I getting at when I said that before? Oh yeah, because the figure bass would usually be 7-5-3 if it was fully intact, because there's no 5th in the chord, it's just 7-3, which is a figure bass I don't find myself using all that often. But that takes us to our tonic triad, G, D, G, and B. Very interesting, very interesting. I want to be careful. It is an interesting chord progression here, especially in cadential context. For imperfect authentic cadences, we get all sorts of different combinations of dominance and tonics and predominance and whatnot. But here, this is a configuration I don't think I've run into before. The fact that we have this extra beat of dominant in between the two and what would usually be like a subdivided cadential progression. Typically we would just expect the A to go down to G, but here we have A to D and then the G, and that causes Bach to harmonize an extra beat, which is interesting. Okay, next phrase, we do see our first modulation. In my opinion, this looks like a half cadence to me, especially with the A and the melody, but I do think this is an imperfect authentic cadence based on what we know about the progressions that Bach uses and how he sort of links them together. But I think you could also analyze this as a half cadence, so I'll leave that up in the air, even though I'm committing to this being an imperfect authentic cadence. So we start off with G major again, G, B, G, and D. No need to reanalyze. We then have A, C, G, and C. Similar to this progression in the first phrase, this G is an accented non-chord tone. It's probably like a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this would be a 7/6 chord, 7/6 suspension, 7/6 chord. That's a funny coincidence. And that would take us to 1/6 like we would expect. B, D, G, and B. 1, 7, 6, 1. So yeah, like I said earlier, the retrograde of this progression is very common in Bach's chorales. Afterwards, we get a passing tone in the bass that takes us to D, D, G, and A. Very common for 4/3 suspensions to occur over dominant triads and root position, but I do think this is where we modulate to the key of D. And 5 now becomes 1, because we're seeing this C sharp here, and sometimes it's a toss-up really depends on how I hear it, because you could will this however you wanted. You could have this be a 5, 7/6 of 5 to 5 chord progression if you hear this as a half cadence, but I hear this A wanting to resolve up to D rather than wanting to resolve down to G. That would be the difference between hearing this as a half cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence. So in this case, I hear it as an imperfect authentic cadence, and sometimes it sounds like a half cadence, and there is more secondary leading tones than just one right before the final cadential chord. So it's interesting how it ends up working out that way. But regardless, E, C sharp, G, and G. This D is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, another 7/6 suspension over a 7/6 chord. That's pretty cool. And then we get our tonic triad, which is sort of functioning like a big dominant. Really, in terms of the form, even though we're cadencing in the key of the dominant, semantically speaking, it's functioning like a dominant overall because D is dominant in relationship to G. Regardless, we're going to be moving back to the key of G for our next phrase, which will introduce our first perfect authentic cadence, kind of creating a binary form, I guess. The perfect authentic cadence bringing the first system to a close, or it happened to work out that it was the first system being brought to a close, but the first 4 measures being contrasted with the second 4 measures. So we start off with D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is B major over D sharp. That's 5/6 of 2. You could say that we start off in the key of G major, and this is 5/6 of 6, but I don't think there's anything inherently G major about hearing a B major chord, so I'm going to wait until we hear E minor to analyze the modulation. We have E, B, F sharp, and G, this F sharp being a 9/8 suspension over our triad. It's very common to see tonic functioning chords. In this case, E minor, despite it being our 2, is being tonicized. So 9/8 suspensions are very common in Bach's writing over root position tonic triads. This is where we modulate back to the key of G, though, in my opinion. It's now our 6th chord. We have another little passing tone here in the alto before we get E, E, G, and C. E, G, and C. Sorry, that kind of confused me for a second. This is a 4/6 chord, C major over E. Kind of interesting to see these two chords together. Really, 6 and 4, more specifically 4/6, they're basically the same chord, both in function and in pitch content. They both have E and G. The only difference is C versus B, so seeing a 4/6 chord after a 6 chord is kind of like seeing a 6 chord for 2 beats, or conversely, it's like seeing a 4/6 chord for 2 beats. But regardless, this 4/6 chord is going to lead us to a subdivided chord progression with F sharp, D, and A with that C, which leads us to, or this chord right here is a 5/6/5 chord, D7 over F sharp, and we would expect that subdivided chord progression to lead us to our tonic G major, G, D, G, and B. This A being a 9/8 suspension over our bass, which again, 9/8 suspensions are very common over the bass of root position tonic triad. That's going to take us to 5, D, D, G, and A. Again, 4/3 suspensions, very common over 5 chords. This chorale is pretty much like proving the narrative I'm trying to convey, which is suspensions typically operate in this fashion in Bach's chorale writing: the 9/8 over the root position tonic, and the 4/3 over the root position dominant, and 7/6 suspensions are over inverted chords, just by nature of the way the chords are spelled. But regardless, we have a delayed passing 7th here in the tenor, and that takes us to our tonic G major: G, B, D, and G. Next phrase ends in a half cadence in the key of G major. Our first half cadence, the way that I see it, of course you could argue that this is a half cadence here, but seeing another D major chord where we cadence with an A in the melody, it looks like there are 2 half cadences here on the page, but this feels genuinely half cadential in comparison to this one, which has C sharp, as opposed to this cadence, which doesn't have any C sharps. In fact, it has C natural in the bass. So we're starting things off with another G major chord: G, D, G, and B. Just a little vocal rotation, no big deal. Passing tones in the outer voices here. I think they're passing tones. Yeah, they're passing tones. And then we get G major over B. B, D, G, and D, which is 1/6. And whenever this comes up in my videos, I like to mention it. When you have 2 Roman numerals that are shared between chords on the same line, I don't reiterate them, like 1 going to 1/6, this is just 6. 1 going to 1/6, this is just 1/6, right? But when I go to a new line, 1 going to 1/6, I reiterate the Roman numeral. That's just a stylistic thing that I do. You don't need to include it in your own analysis. It's just like I said, it felt kind of natural to do, so I just kept on doing it. But just a little detail. We also have a passing tone here in the tenor, and that takes us to B, B, G, and D. It's another 1/6 chord, no need to reanalyze. It kind of gets turned into 6 here. 6 and 1/6 are similar to one another. Well, just 6 and 1 are similar to one another because they both have G and B. The difference is D and E between the 2 chords, so this E is going to function as a non-chord tone. Maybe there is a little 6 chord happening there. I don't really think it makes too much of a difference. Really, I'm sort of the mindset, and if you've watched my videos in the past, you might be aware of my opinion on the matter, but when you have a chord progression in a chorale like this, I think that there need to be at least 2 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm in order to constitute a chord progression. Like, let's say for example we have this imperfect authentic cadence here. We have A, we have C, E, and A. That's an A minor chord if you look at it from that context, but we have one voice that's moving stepwise, and all that does is when you take F sharp and replace the E with it, it turns the chord into F sharp diminished. So maybe one voice has the potential to create a chord progression. I personally just hear it as the chord sort of morphing from one into the other, and your interpretation is sort of based on which note you hear as the chord tone. Whereas you have something like this, for example, where even though it's very brief, it's just an example that lends itself to be here in this particular chorale, but we have 2/7 going to 5. Notice how in order to get from 2/7 to 5, you need to move 2 voices in order to constitute that chord progression. Maybe it's just nature of the fact that 2 and 7 are a third apart, and you only need to move 1 voice to make a chord progression that is a third apart. Same thing here with 1 going to 6, but I don't really feel like thirds-based chord progressions happen all that often, at least in my opinion, in a subdivided fashion, unless more than 1 voice is moving. I feel sort of just a nature of the relationship between the chords, just an objective fact, in my opinion, about the relationship between chords that are a third apart: 1 and 6, 2 and 7, 3 and 1. Anywho, so this E, there may be a 6 chord going on here, 6/7 even more specifically, but doesn't make too much of a difference. We then go to A, C, G, and C. I think this G is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and we're going to get a 7/6 chord as a result, F sharp diminished over A. And that's going to take us not to 1, but rather to 1/6, which is not super uncommon, but 7 resolving to 1 is a very common chord progression that we see not just in Bach, but in tonal music in general. We get B, D, G, and B. So G major over B, passing tone in the bass, and then we get D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord. Again, 4-3 suspensions are very common over 5 chords, especially when they're in root position. 4-3 suspensions are common over the bass, over root position 5 chords. This is in a cadential context, which sometimes we see tonic triads having a 4-3 suspension over them as well, but it's very common for 5 chords to have 4-3 suspensions over them especially. We're going to see a phrase that has a beginning similar to the ending of the previous system. We have D sharp and E starting things off here. And I think this is going to not lead us to the key of E minor, but rather to the key of A minor for a half cadence at the end of the phrase. So we have D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is B major over D sharp. That's 5-6 of 6 in this case, not 5-6 of 2, but rather 5-6 of 6. And then we go to 6, E minor, E, B, E, and G. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, and then we get C, D, D, and G. I think this C is an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually 1-6, B, D, D, and G. And on the next beat we have C, C, E, and A, which is A minor over C. That's 2-6, and this is where I think the modulation to A minor is happening. It's now 1-6, passing tone in the bass, and then we get A, D, E, and B. A, B, E, and B. A is probably another accented non-chord tone. Bach sort of created this symmetry between the two halves of the measure here, where we have non-chord tones on the inner eighth notes of the 4 eighth note groups. And this is something that we see a lot in Bach, where we have G sharp, B, E, and B instead, which is 5-6, E major over G sharp. And now we're getting ready for our cadence. We have A, B, E, and C, which is A minor in root position. Passing tone here in the bass. This B is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. Again, 9/8 suspensions are very common over tonic triads, but in cadential situations we know Bach to be very contrapuntal. Did I say contrapuntal situations? I meant cadential situations. Bach tends to be the most contrapuntal. G sharp's a little neighboring embellishment here. C, A, E, and C is just taking our tonic triad and inverting it. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Another passing tone in the bass, and that takes us to E major, E, G sharp, E, and B. Again, 4-3 suspensions being very common over 5 chords, especially in root position in Bach. Next phrase is a little interesting. It ends in a plagal cadence in the key of G major, but I think we start things off in the key of G major despite this F natural being there. I don't think we have a beginning here in the key of C major. It does sound like starting with the G major triad, especially with how prevalent G major has been in the chorale so far. Even though the F natural is there, I don't think it's playing a role in terms of dictating the key. I think that we are still in the key of G major here, and instead of starting on our tonic, which I think would be a valid analysis, I think it might be a little bit more informed to analyze this as 5-6 of 4 because of the F natural and where that F natural tends to want to resolve. And in this case it'll resolve to E, which is the third of our 4 chord. C, G, E, and C. Of course, if you wanted to be very granular, and if you heard this progression as a 5-1 in the key of C major by itself, and then we progressed into the key of G major, that's totally valid. Here, I just hear the G major chord, and even with the F natural, it just sounds G major-like to me, so that's where my analysis is going. 4 is going to take us to 5, D, D, F sharp, and A. G is a 4-3 suspension over our dominant. As I've said, very common to see 4-3 suspensions over 5 chords. And then we go to G major. G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad, 4-5-1. Very straightforward progression in Bach, or just very straightforward tonal progression in general. Passing 7th in the bass. And then we get E, E, G, and C. It's a 4-6 chord, C major over E. And that takes us to G major over B. Kind of interesting to see an inverted plagal cadence here. B, D, G, and D. It's actually kind of interesting. It has the workings of maybe even being a half cadence in the key of C major, but I think with the F sharp being so close to the cadence, it feels like we really are in the key of G major here, and this is just a quirky cadence. This is the third chorale that I've analyzed in a row that's had an interesting penultimate cadence. This is definitely the least interesting objectively in comparison to the other two that I've analyzed. Check out yesterday's episode and the day before yesterday's episode if you're interested. We have some really quirky cadences. But yeah, inverted cadences are always interesting when you come across them. Just sort of makes you wonder why. But yeah, regardless, I actually have a theory. So typically 4/6 going to 1, we usually connect the bass via the leading tone, and if Bach didn't want that sound, going to a 1/6 chord rather than a root position tonic triad might have made a little bit more consistency sense in terms of his harmonic tendencies. Something that we see quite often in Bach is 4/6 going to 1, but instead of getting a fully voiced 7 chord, like we do sometimes, we usually just get the leading tone connecting the E and the G in this case, or in general just 6 going to 1. We very seldom, I think we've only once seen 4/6 go to 1 without a connecting tone between the two bass notes. So the fact that he skips down to 1/6 here might be a commentary on that. But to close out the chorale, perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, no modulations. Starting the phrase off again with E minor. We've seen that a couple of times now, so I wonder what the significance of that is, or if there is any significance behind it. We have E, B, E, and G. So E minor, still our 6th chord, passing 7th on the bass, C, C, E, and A. A minor over C, 6 going to 2, very typical cycle of falling fifths progression. We have some subdivision here with D and F sharp in the inner voices. That gives us C, D, F sharp, and A, which is 5/4-2. And that's going to take us exactly where we would expect, which is our tonic triad and first inversion, B, D, G, and B. Typically, 4/2 chords in Bach resolve down by step in the bass, and the roots are a fifth apart, so 5/4-2 to 1/6. We don't always see this. Sometimes we see some interesting progressions that in the analysis don't look super intuitive, but usually Bach's resolutions make sense. The one that we usually see most commonly is the bass resolving down by step. That's pretty much always consistent, but the roots are also usually a fifth apart, a fifth down, that is. Then we have E, which is a non-chord tone, E, which is also a non-chord tone, very similar to the 1/6 going to the E we saw at the beginning of the system, but I think we're just doubling the E here. It's really not two voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, in my opinion, because they're really kind of just doubling one another. They are an octave apart, but still, maybe there is a 6 chord going on there, and coincidentally it would be the same progression that we had here, where it would be 6 going to 7/6, but like I said, I don't really think it's super impactful in the grand scheme of the harmony. 1/6 and 6 are very similar in terms of their function. So we have A, C, G, and C. Another 7/6 suspension over a 7/6 chord. That's pretty interesting that we're seeing this. I have to go back in my other analyses and see if 7/6 suspensions are common over 7/6 chords. It's pretty cool. But that's going to take us to our tonic triad. Another 7/6 going to 1/6. We have B, D, G, and B. And then very briefly, it goes back to root position here in the bass, where B goes down to G. That takes us to C, E, G, and A. A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. F sharp is a non-chord tone. E is a chord tone. That takes us to D major, our 5 chord. D, D, F sharp, and A. A little delayed passing 7th here in the tenor, and that takes us to our tonic, G major, G, B, D, and G. And that's going to be today's analysis. Really, all in all, like I said, really not too much to write home about in this particular chorale. Everything operates the way that I would expect it to operate. I'd say the tonic operating as 5/4 at the beginning of our penultimate phrase is probably the most interesting thing in this chorale, but really all the harmony operates in the way that we would expect. So that made the chorale straightforward to analyze. So I think I'm going to cap the video off on that thought. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.